I want you to imagine standing at your best friend's wedding, holding a glass of champagne, toasting to his happiness, and in that exact moment, realizing with absolute gut wrenching clarity that you are in love with his bride. Not a crush, not admiration, love. The kind that wraps around your ribs and squeezes until you can't breathe properly. And the worst part? She's looking at him like he's the whole universe. And you're standing there smiling because what else do you do? What else can you do? You smile, you clink your glass, and you swallow it down like broken glass with a champagne chaser. That was 3 years ago, and I've never told a single soul. Until now. Hey, welcome back to Listen to My Story. If you're new here, this is the place where real people share the stories they've never been able to tell out loud. The complicated, the messy, the deeply human stuff that doesn't fit neatly into a conversation over dinner. Today's story comes from a listener I'll call Marcus. He reached out a few months ago with a message that honestly stopped me cold. He said, and I'm quoting directly here, I don't need advice. I don't need judgment. I just need someone to finally hear this because I've been carrying it alone for years. So, Marcus, this one's for you and for everyone else out there carrying something heavy in silence. Let's get into it. Marcus and Daniel had been best friends since they were 9 years old. Think about that for a second. 9 years old. That's the kind of friendship that doesn't really have a clean origin story. It just exists, like a law of nature. They grew up 2 streets apart in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place where summers feel endless and everyone knows everyone's business. They rode bikes together, got detention together, failed their driving tests on the same day, Marcus by going too slow, Daniel by nearly taking out a parking meter. By the time they hit their 20s, they were the kind of friends who didn't need to call before showing up, who could sit in the same room for 3 hours without saying a word and still feel like it was a great afternoon. The kind of friendship that most people search for their whole lives and never quite find. Marcus described Daniel as the most genuinely good person he'd ever known. Not good in a boring, plain vanilla way, good in a way that cost him something. Daniel was the guy who'd drive 40 minutes at midnight because you texted him that you were having a rough night. The guy who remembered the names of your parents, your siblings, your dog, who showed up to things, who stayed. So when Daniel called Marcus one afternoon and said, I met someone and I think she might be the one, Marcus was genuinely, fully, completely happy for him. Her name was Claire. And here's the thing about Claire. Marcus didn't fall in love with her the moment he met her. He wants to make that clear. This wasn't some lightning bolt, love at first sight betrayal waiting to happen. When Daniel first introduced them at a casual Italian place, just the three of them at a neighborhood Italian place, Marcus thought she was lovely. Smart, funny, easy to talk to. He was glad his best friend had found someone good. He went home that night thinking, she's great, he's lucky. That was it. Clean, simple, safe. Claire was a landscape architect, the kind of person who looked at an empty lot and saw a garden. She had this particular way of getting excited about things that Marcus would later struggle to describe without smiling. When something interested her, she'd lean forward slightly like she was afraid the conversation might get away from her. She asked questions the way most people forget to, like she was genuinely cataloging your answer, storing it somewhere important. She was warm without being performative about it, interesting without trying to impress anyone, and she was absolutely, unambiguously in love with Daniel. Marcus watched them together and felt nothing complicated for a long time, months actually. He hung out with them as a couple, celebrated their 1-year anniversary dinner, helped Daniel pick out a ring. He was the best man at their engagement party. He gave a toast that made Claire cry, happy tears, the good kind. And Daniel clapped him on the back and said, I love you, man. I mean it. Everything was exactly as it should be. And then, slowly, in the most inconvenient and unwanted way imaginable, things started to shift. It happened in pieces. That's the thing about this kind of feeling. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on the door. It just starts quietly rearranging the furniture while you're not looking. and one day you walk into the room and nothing is where you left it. Marcus thinks it started about 8 months into Daniel and Claire's marriage. Daniel had taken a new job that required travel. Nothing outrageous, but 2 or 3 times a month he'd be gone for 4 or 5 days at a stretch. And because Daniel trusted Marcus completely, and because Claire was still relatively new to the city, Daniel would often check in with Marcus. "Hey, Claire's flying solo this week. Maybe grab dinner with her if you get a chance, just so she's not rattling around that apartment alone." And Marcus would, of course he would. That's what you do. At first, those dinners were just dinners. They'd talk about Daniel, about work, about the neighborhood, about whatever movie or documentary had everyone buzzing that week. But gradually, the way rivers gradually carve canyons, too slow to notice until the damage is done, the conversations deepened. He found out that Claire had a complicated relationship with her mother, that she'd wanted to be a poet before she decided to redirect her love of living things into landscape design, that she had a reoccurring dream about a house she'd never been to, and it bothered her more than she could logically explain, that she was more afraid of being ordinary than she was of almost anything else. And she found out things about Marcus, too, things he hadn't talked about in years, his parents' divorce and how it had quietly rewired the way he thought about permanence, the version of his life he'd imagined at 22 that he'd since quietly folded up and put away, the way he sometimes sat in his apartment on Sunday mornings and felt a loneliness so specific it almost had a shape. These weren't conversations people have when they're just being polite. These were the conversations of two people who had, without entirely meaning to, become genuinely important to each other. And Marcus noticed, God help him, he noticed, that he was thinking about their next dinner before the current one had ended. He told himself it was just friendship, that Claire was becoming a friend in her own right, separate from her role as Daniel's wife. And that was allowed, that was normal. There was nothing wrong with it. But then one evening, they were sitting on a park bench after dinner because neither of them was quite ready for the night to end. And Claire said something, Marcus can't even remember what it was exactly, something funny and a little self-deprecating, and he laughed, really laughed, and she turned to look at him with this expression he'd never seen directed at him before. Not romantic, not inappropriate, just seen. Like she was genuinely glad he existed. And something in Marcus's chest cracked open like a fault line. He went home that night and sat on his kitchen floor, not dramatically, he just sort of ended up there, and he thought very carefully about what he was feeling, the way you carefully examine something you've just found and desperately hope is not what you think it is. It was exactly what he thought it was. He was in love with Claire, quietly, completely, and with absolutely no idea what to do about it. Marcus decided on a strategy, and the strategy was suppression. Classic, time-honored, deeply ineffective suppression. He pulled back slightly. Not dramatically, he wasn't going to blow up his friendship with Daniel by suddenly becoming distant without explanation, but he started making excuses for the solo dinners. He replied to Claire's texts a little slower. He made sure there were always other people around when they spent time together. And for a few months, it almost worked. He convinced himself that the feeling was fading, that he'd successfully starved it of oxygen and it was dying quietly, the way he needed it to. Then came the night everything cracked open for real. It was a Friday. Daniel was traveling. Marcus had genuinely been avoiding Claire for about 6 weeks, and she noticed, of course she noticed, because Claire paid attention. She texted him, "Did I do something? You've been weird and I'd rather know than wonder." He couldn't ignore that. It wasn't in him to let her think she'd done something wrong when she hadn't done a single thing except exist in a way that had undone him completely. He texted back, "No, nothing. Just been in my head. Come over, I'll cook." He spent the entire afternoon arguing with himself about whether that was a terrible idea. He cooked anyway. She showed up with a bottle of wine and the easy comfort of someone who is genuinely glad to see you, and for a few hours, everything was almost normal. They ate, they talked, they moved through the apartment the way people do when they're comfortable with each other's presence. And then, late in the evening, sitting on his couch with the television on in the background, Claire went quiet in a way that felt different from regular quiet. Marcus looked over and she was staring at nothing in particular, and she had that expression she sometimes got, the one he'd come to recognize as her carrying face. "Are you okay?" he asked. And she said something that rearranged his entire understanding of everything. She said, "Do you ever feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be, but somehow still a little lost?" And Marcus, because he was a fool, because he was tired of carrying it alone, because in that moment the feeling was bigger than his ability to contain it, said very quietly, Yeah, I know that feeling really well right now." Something passed between them in the silence that followed. Marcus still can't fully describe it. Not a moment of temptation, he wants to be clear about that. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. But it was an acknowledgement, a mutual, unspoken recognition that something in the room had weight to it. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and then she said gently, with the kind of care that made him love her even more and hate himself for it, "Marcus, what's going on with you?" And he did the only honest and decent thing he could think of. He said, "Nothing I'd ever act on. Nothing that will ever be your problem. I promise you that." He didn't confirm anything. He didn't have to. She was too perceptive for vague non-answers, but she was also too good a person to push him into a confession that would only cause damage. She nodded slowly. She picked up her glass of wine, and after a moment she said, "You're one of the best people I know, Marcus. I hope you know that." And then she changed the subject, completely, deliberately, and with a grace that he's thought about 100 times since. She protected him. She protected Daniel. She protected all three of them in that single careful pivot. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and took a long, honest inventory of who he was and who he wanted to be. He thought about Daniel. Daniel, who drove 40 minutes at midnight for his friends, who remembered everyone's names, who had looked at Marcus at his wedding and said, "I love you, man," and meant every syllable. He thought about what it would mean to nurture this feeling, to let it breathe, to follow it even an inch in any direction. And he made a decision, not dramatically, not in a wave of noble self-sacrifice, but in the quiet, clear-eyed way that real decisions actually get made. He decided that whatever he felt, it was his to carry. Not Daniel's problem, not Claire's burden, his. He also decided, and this took longer and was harder, that he needed space, real space. Not the half-hearted avoidance he'd been attempting, but a genuine, loving, honest step back. He called Daniel a few weeks later, told him he'd been offered a project opportunity in another city, that he was thinking of taking it. Which was true. He'd been sitting on the offer for 2 months, unsure. He took the job. He moved to Seattle. He and Daniel still talk regularly. They still have that friendship, the kind that survives distance because it was never really about proximity in the first place. Daniel visited him in Seattle last Thanksgiving. They watched football and argued about the same things they'd been arguing about since they were 19. And it was good. It was real. Marcus doesn't know what Claire understood or suspected. She never mentioned their last evening again. When they're in the same space at the same time, holidays, the occasional visit, she's warm with him, easy with him, the same way she always was, which Marcus thinks is its own kind of answer about the kind of person she is. The feeling didn't disappear overnight. Feelings like that don't. They're stubborn tenants. But slowly, over time, distance and honesty and a conscious decision to redirect his energy into his own life did what suppression never could. It didn't vanish so much as transform into something quieter, something he could acknowledge without drowning in. A small contained thing in a locked room he only walks past occasionally now. He started therapy in Seattle, started running, started actually letting people in instead of keeping them at the specific, comfortable distance he'd perfected over years. He went on dates, some terrible, 1 or 2 genuinely promising. He thinks, and this is his word, He thinks he's healing. Here's what Marcus said to me at the end of his message, and I've read it enough times now that I have it almost memorized. I'm not telling this story because I'm proud of what I felt. I'm telling it because I spent so long being ashamed of it that I forgot the important part. I didn't do anything wrong. I felt something I didn't ask for, and I made choices every day about who I wanted to be despite it. That counts for something. I think it counts for a lot. And I've been sitting with that ever since. Because here's the thing. We talk a lot about love like it's always clean, like it arrives in the right package at the right time, knocking on the right door. But real human emotional life is so much messier and more complicated than that. Sometimes the heart makes moves that the mind hasn't approved. Sometimes you find yourself feeling something that has no good place to go, no narrative that ends well, no version of the story where everyone gets what they want. And in those moments, what defines you isn't the feeling, it's what you do with it. Marcus didn't betray his best friend. He didn't confess in a way that would have detonated 3 people's lives for the sake of his own emotional relief. He didn't tell himself a convenient story to justify doing something he knew was wrong. He felt something enormous and difficult, and he carried it with more quiet dignity than most people manage with far smaller things. I think about the version of this story that could have gone differently, the version where he leans into it, where he lets a moment of honesty become an open door. And I think about what would have been lost: a lifelong friendship, a marriage, 2 people's happiness, and ultimately Marcus's own sense of who he is. Sometimes loving someone means protecting the life they've built, even from yourself, especially from yourself. So if you're out there right now carrying something you didn't ask to feel, something complicated, something with no clean answer, I hope this story finds you. I hope Marcus's honesty gives you a little permission to stop being so ashamed of being human, and a little inspiration to keep choosing who you want to be. Because that quiet, daily, unglamorous choice might just be the most important love story of all. Thanks for listening to Listen to My Story. If today's story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have your own story, the kind you've been carrying alone, you know where to find us. Until next time, take care of yourselves.